And so we want to get right into it. Of course, Mark, we're going to ask the first question to you and have you get us started. It was announced kind of unofficially earlier last week, but then officially on Thursday last week that the WNBA is expanding for the first time since it added the Atlanta Dream. And it's headed to the Bay. The Golden State Warriors have been granted a WNBA team, and that team can start playing in the league as soon as 2025. Mark, what's your reaction to that? How do you feel about that? What should we expect? What should fans expect come 2025 when it comes to the WNBA heading to the Bay?
Yeah, I mean, this is huge. It goes without saying. I think part of what is really interesting, at least from what I've noticed, a lot of people in my generation. So like I was born in 1997. So like obviously like right when the league starts, right? And I feel like I always had a background understanding the league. I always knew about Sue Bird, Diana Taurasi. But I didn't know about a lot of the legends of the game because when I was coming up, it was once we started hitting the mid to late 2000s into the early 2010s, where even though the basketball was still phenomenal, that's where we started to see a little bit of the dip down in attendance. And I think part of what's so exciting about what this is I think that this is set up so much better, at least from my looking back and seeing what things were like then to now. I think this is set up to be like very long term. Like, I mean, obviously, like, you never know how long an entire league is going to last. But like, I think the whole idea here is like, it has taken a long time. I've never really gotten to witness expansion in my lifetime, like memorable lifetime, I should say. Like, I feel like this is number one for me. It's just about like, this is going to be long lasting. This is an incredible ownership group that gives a shit. Sorry, I didn't think that cares. That like, I think I saw some people like, oh well, they're getting like their used arenas and stuff. Like the arena just got updated recently, so I believe they're gonna be playing at Oracle. Like yes, it's a little bit older, but it's a really nice arena. The facilities they're going to be using are fantastic, like state of the art stuff that is going to be right up there automatically with the top of the top in the league. And I think this is just again like another stepping stone towards pushing everyone else to another level. And I think there's a lot of interesting stuff we can talk about on what that fallout might be. But I think that was kind of my first thought. And like, hey, I mean, obviously it's just awesome, but that like, especially like noting like, yes, it's taken a while, but this is why they wanted to have an ownership group that was serious, that was going to put in the funds and the effort necessary to make this long lasting.
And just on the topic of expansion, this is a little off topic, but just on the broader subject of just expansion of the W and of the league. When you look at the next couple of drafts that we're all looking at that are highly anticipated, the talent, the players that are coming out, and you think about the dynamic of NIL and just Angel Reese, the fame, the power that's now coming with not just the talent. I mean, the talent is growing and developing at a rapid pace, but now it's also the fame and the attention. And one of the things I can't wait to see is how that translates into the W at the next level. So as the league expands with more teams and more everything, what are you seeing and sensing in terms of how ready the league is for this talent that is coming their way in the next few years?
That's such a good question, man, because that's something I've thought about a lot. And I talked about this. I did a bigger feature on DeWanna Bonner that came out recently. And I talked about this with her because she was like point blank. She's like, I don't think that I could come up in what this era is now, like in being a star and having to handle social media because it's just different. Like we mentioned Hannah off rip. And to her credit, like I think part of what's so fascinating about Hannah, like she is one of the most cerebral 18-year-olds I've ever met. Both in how she sees the game and just her perspective in general. But like, she's been a star since she was in middle school. And like, obviously like every player in the W has been a high level player since they were 10 or 11, with a couple of exceptions. But the difference is like, okay, Hannah's been blowing up on TikTok and IG and Overtime since she was that age. And I think like, even like you can talk about like players who are freshmen, sophomore in college, sophomore, juniors in college right now that were at that same level, but didn't have that same kind of built-in fandom coming in. And part of it too is like, obviously she has a very flashy game. So that plays a part, but like you mentioned, I think that's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out, because I think that's going to drastically change how coverage goes. I think we're going to see more stuff transition towards how it is with the NBA. And I wonder, like, not that it's a bad thing. I think growth is good. But it's definitely going to be an adjustment period, because I do think in some ways, like, we'll have people who come in much more media ready. But also I wonder, like, necessarily what that means in some ways. Because, like, just in general, like, you're going to come up a little bit more guarded when you've dealt with that since such an early age, I'd imagine. So it's good stuff. But I think, especially when you start talking about something continuing to grow and expand, like, that's the stuff that's going to come along with it.
On that same note of being ready, right? Obviously, owner Joe Lacob, who is, of course, the owner of the Golden State Warriors, who's been on a kind of dynastic run over the past couple of years in the NBA, he made a very bold statement during the opening press conference that this team would win a championship within the first 5 years. And at first, you think that's a pretty crazy thing to say, but when you couple what Martin talked about as far as, like, the college players coming out at that time, but also I think another point that's worth mentioning is there's a lot of high-level players who are not signing long-term contracts because a new collective bargaining agreement for the WNBA is going to kick off in that 2025 season. So it seems like the stars are aligning. How much would you say that also plays into part to not just the readiness for this team, but also to the point that Joe made in that opening presser, like the likelihood that they do in fact win a championship within the first 5 years of existence for them?
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting thing. Like, I was pretty taken aback that was the automatic thing. Like, that's not, I mean, like, having seen Joe Lacob for years now, I'm not super surprised that he said that after sitting on it. But it is, like, that's a big statement to come out and make, because, like, you think about any team that's ever been an expansion team in any league. Like, I think right away about the Vancouver Grizzlies, like, when they first came up and how much of a struggle it was for them to get off the ground. But again, like, it's different, because I think so much of what will be fascinating with that is how do the next year and a half / 2 years of teams being like, hey, we have to up our ante, we have to improve, and we have to make our infrastructure that much better. Because, I mean, I think we're already getting to the point now where once that team is added, we're 4-5 teams, because obviously Liberty, Aces, Seattle, and now this Golden State team are all going to have their own facilities. If your team does not have their own facilities, you are at a disadvantage, like, point blank period. Like, there are obviously some fantastic organizations that don't, but I think at this point, especially with that team announcing it, you're behind the eight ball. Like, people would love to live in the Bay Area. Like, obviously there's a lot more that goes into free agency than just that, but for people who are serious about winning and building their legacy, like, having those kinds of accommodations is huge. So again, I think it just goes back to that being substantial. What will be, again, interesting is, like, what happens in the CBA. How does that change things? I'm going to be really curious to see how aggressive they are in hiring people. Like, are they going to hire a coach? Like, I'm not they're going to hire somebody right now, but, like, I feel like, especially when you're building a team, you would kind of like to have a coach built in around the same time as a GM, or, president, however that the front office is set up. That's going to be really interesting to watch. And especially too, like, are they going to bring over people from their NBA side? Is it going to be more people who've been in the W? What is that going to look like? Because that team is just they don't have ties to the W like that. So it's going to be really trial and error. And what's so fascinating is, like, they could have 8 million different outcomes. Like, I don't think it would be crazy if they really hit the ground running. And I think it's probably more likely that they win if they don't get a draft pick that's crazy high, or I'd imagine, especially, like, looking at the last couple of teams that have won, like, building through free agency is, I don't want to say it's necessarily the way. Like, obviously the Aces, when you look at, the Aces needed 3 number 1 draft picks to get this spot. And that doesn't denigrate what they did in terms of building. That's more just, like, that's how hard it is. And you have to hit on every pick too. And then, well, the Liberty are, like, one of the first teams we've really seen that was built like this in free agency. And a lot of that was because of everything they did to build up infrastructure wise. So really long-winded way of saying, like, I think it's possible, but it's just going to really count on how things align throughout.
Hey, I've seen people campaigning for, like, some players. I think Chelsea
Gray, yeah.
So there could be, and being affiliated with the Warriors, there could be a lot of incentive for players to say, like, hey, I'm sign me right up. I want to go there and play right away. So I think there's a lot of appeal there. It's going to be really interesting right away.
Definitely.
And I just also wanted to, another thing that I thought was interesting is when you look back to when we saw a lot of teams, Mark, you mentioned earlier how like around the 2010s things started to decline. That was right around the time when the WNBA changed the way they were structured and made it so that NBA teams couldn't necessarily like have their own team. And we saw a lot of the teams that a lot of people love, like the Soul and the Fire and the Shock and teams like that kind of either move or go defunct because independent ownership groups couldn't fund the teams anymore. With the Warriors now getting a team again, or for the first time, and this being another NBA team that has a team, do you think this opens the door for more NBA teams either to bring back a team that we saw before, or also in a situation like, say, Toronto, for example, maybe get a team there that's never been there before?
Yeah. That's something I haven't really thought about too much. Like, I think it's definitely possible. Like, there are teams that have like quote unquote ties, like the Mavs and Wings are loosely adjoined. I don't know how deep that really runs. I don't think that it's anything wild. But they do definitely do stuff like hand in hand. Like I know like Satu has worked for the Mavs and in doing some stuff like around their corporate sales, and just doing stuff to have like so she could stay in Dallas and like still be working around and stuff. And I know they've done that for a couple other players. But as far as like obviously I think the Liberty and the Nets are probably the closest right now. Obviously Clara Tsai and Joe Tsai are hugely around that team. And obviously I think a lot of it just ties back to everything being in Barclays and how that plays out. But I mean, I think it's definitely possible that we see more of it, especially, I mean, like, yeah, because the Pacers are still it's Pacers Sports and Entertainment still with the Fever, but it all just depends on how connected it is. So, I mean, it's certainly possible. It'd be really interesting to see what happens with that, though.